All right, what is going on, everybody? We've got week 3 of the NFL season coming in hot here this week. And while we've had a lot of product and front end changes kind of at the forefront in the first couple weeks of the season, the models team has been putting in a ton of work on our NFL sims and projections over the course of the offseason and into the first couple weeks of the season. So, wanted to bring Matt and Will on today to talk a little bit about some of the improvements we've made in that area, what some of the things we're seeing so far to start the season look like. We got a lot to talk about here today. So first off, Matt, Will, how are you guys doing?
Good. Excited to be here.
Doing great.
Awesome, cool. Well, do you either of you guys just want to kick it off here with just an overview of some of the big improvements that we've made for this year?
Yeah, I'll start it off. Yeah, we haven't talked about it too much on Discord or anything, but we ended up making pretty huge changes to the model this year. And I guess just to like kind of get right to it, the biggest thing is that we are much more um, impacted by, and I don't want to say reliant on, but we are very much using Vegas sportsbook odds and props as kind of a primary input into the model. So, I mean, I think in the past, we have used like the sportsbook lines as sort of guidelines or safety rails of like, oh, let's not get too far past. Let's like try to get the team totals to get closer, and like looked at props, but not really kind of incorporated them into the model. And we kind of realized, as especially as sports betting has become so big, there obviously are edges in betting props, and like prop lines are not this like these perfectly efficient markets, but they're kind of this like wisdom of the crowds data, especially as we get closer and closer to game time. Prop lines are very good. They are not easy. It is not easy to beat props. And we were thinking like, why are we trying to like spend all this like effort trying to like get um, better than props when we have this data that's really high quality and really good that we can actually incorporate into the model rather than trying to like kind of tiptoe around it. So we made the decision to really like lean in to sportsbook lines, not just player stat props, but um, you know, the money line total spreads, all the these alt totals, and like all basically anything that you can bet on. We're going to try to incorporate into the sim, not as a kind of taking those and backing out of them, but using them as essentially like smart inputs into the sim, and then kind of after the sim runs, using them as ways to kind of guide the end results. So I would say the really the biggest impact practically for users is we are using player props as kind of inputs to adjust the rates that go into the sim. And so we are directly trying to get close to props. And so as props change, and as they get posted, we're going to be rerunning sims to adjust for that. And I think Will and I were talking a few days ago that just we're really excited about how things look. I think, you know, Will's probably more apprehensive about the idea of having this like really like sports book prop based sim, just because it's like, there's a bit of a pride thing of like we built this really good model that wasn't based on that, and now we're kind of like trying to incorporate it into it. But like when you look at the projections that we've been publishing, how this sim is working, and the fact that we're still able to run the same core like play by play sim that we had before. Nothing really about the like actual um like framework of the sim has changed. We've made a bunch of optimizations and speed improvements and stuff like that, but like we are still running play-by-play sims that account for the context of the game, that have all of the game scripts and all the same like values of like the correlations and the upsides that we did before. But now we're using all of this data that was there freely available, really, that is like sharp and wisdom of the crowds based. And we're using that as really a way to like shape our sims. So yeah.
Yeah, I have a few questions on that right off the bat, but Will, anything you wanted to add on there? I think it's interesting. Matt mentioned you might have been a little apprehensive here with this direction. Just kind of your thoughts on this project.
Yeah, so I mean, I think maybe apprehensive isn't the right word, but like Matt's right. There's definitely like a lot of pride in the old model. Like
Hmm.
that was my baby. I worked, did a lot of cool stuff for it. But it really just makes a lot of sense to incorporate this data, just in terms of like, it makes sure that like we're going to have like on Sunday like good, smart projections,
Hmm.
and like we don't have to worry about like, oh, there's some weird like we were getting weird data on like this guy, and so he's a bazillion yards. Like it's a lot safer,
Hmm.
which is a lot less stress, and it's still like the most important thing to me, which is what Matt touched on, is like we're still doing the context of the game stuff. So like we may be smarter now with like this quarterback's completion percentage, but it's still changing if they're like throwing a halfback screen versus like a 30-yard deep pass.
Hmm.
It still changes the completion percentage in the sim, and we're still accounting for all of those factors that change play to play. That like you can't get those from props, but we can know. Okay, well we know that it's going to end up being about 55% completion, and so I think it's really good that we're incorporating that data and staying true to like how we do the play-by-play sims.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think there's a couple objections that I tend to hear from people when you start talking about Vegas, and um, one of them, and you mentioned being safer, Will. I think people's reaction to that at first hearing that might actually be negative sometimes, right? Like we're playing tournaments with 100,000 people. Like I don't want to do something safe, like wisdom of the crowd. Maybe I want to fade the crowd, right? Can you either you guys talk a little bit about how like we're still kind of retaining an edge there, or how we still feel comfortable in building lineups that are poised to beat the hundreds of thousands of people you need to beat in a DFS contest, while kind of relying on this data that we think is like safer, or kind of more in line with the wisdom of the crowd.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that there's still a lot of, especially for NFL, there's a
Hmm.
lot of people playing really bad lineups that
Hmm.
are like not either not using projections, using bad projections, just like hand built based on players they like. When you're going into the, especially like the big tournaments, like really probably the edge is just like you beat the bad
Hmm.
lineups. Even if you're not the best player in the world, you can certainly be profitable in NFL just like playing good plays, even if they're safe. But then there's also, of course, like the game theory aspect, and why contest sims are so valuable is that even if you're playing projections that are essentially the same as what the field is playing, you can beat the field based on game theory, based on lineup construction, um, lineups that are correlated to have high upside and have players that have high upside. All that stuff is still valuable, even if like the mean projections are safe and we're not like taking huge stands. And then the last thing I think is that like I think this makes it actually a lot easier to take stands because you can, if you think that a prop is worth betting, then that means you think that the player projection is worth changing, right? And so like you can, I think before it was like if you're using SaberSim and we have a big stand on a player that's different than a prop, you're kind of forced into that play. Like you kind of are not, you're not forced, you can obviously change the projection, but we're going to like say, hey, you need to be overexposed to this player. And I think now we're more leaving it in the user's hands in terms of making those stands that are different than like what the markets think. And we're saying here are like the sims based on like wisdom of the crowds. If you want to be different than the crowd, if you think that the prop line is wrong, if you think the crowd is wrong, whatever, you can change it. But like, we think that even if we can be slightly more accurate than props, there's higher risk. There's higher risk of like, oh yeah, we're a couple, you know, points, DFS points off from what the prop implied projection would be. And now again, you're getting forced this like 50% exposure to a player that is just high risk if we are wrong, And so it's I don't want to just focus on playing it safe because I think it's more than being
Right.
safe. I think it's that we're leaning into the wisdom of the crowd's philosophy of like, you know, even if there are edges, like in in any sort of prediction thing, like very often you take all of the data and all of these different opinions about players, and like the prop sportsbook lines really are just like the aggregate of a bunch of different opinions about
Hmm.
what players will do. And that's kind of our philosophy, is we're going to take that valuable data and use it. So
As we're looking at the different markets that we're pulling in, you mentioned like not only just the spreads and the money lines, but also alt totals, alt spreads, obviously the player props. How do we um, assign a value to each of those different markets in terms of like how accurate their information is? Obviously,
mhm,
the liquidity of those different markets is going to be different. We probably
yeah.
have a different way of thinking about each of those. How does that kind of come together?
Yeah, so we do prioritize um the more liquid markets, the money line, total, spread. Um and so as we're gonna prioritize getting like the team totals correct basically first of all.
Hmm.
Um and like everything else is like a little bit lower priority, but obviously for DFS, like the player stats do matter, probably more than the team totals, but it kind of cascades down, right? If you get the team totals right, then that's obviously going to affect the accuracy of all the players. If we get the QB right, that'll affect all the accuracy of the wide receivers and even the running backs too. So um, it in general, like we have created a really, really cool approach technically to be able to like take, these hundreds and hundreds of different like bets and kind of use them in a smart way. Um, but yeah, we are basically focusing on like the stronger signals of the like team total, game total, spread type markets first.
And I know it's only been 2 weeks, but you mentioned at the start here that we've already seen some promising things for the start of the season. What have we seen so far that makes us excited about this here? Or looking at like projections or correlations or percentiles, what are some of the indicators that we've made an improvement?
So for me, the biggest one is with rookies, because
Yeah.
those are just always a nightmare. Like the start of every season, it's just a nightmare to like project them because it's hard to deal like limited college data. Like we have their draft position, but like the market is like probably a bit bullish on some rookies, and like, but in general, there it's a way better baseline than what I think we were working with before.
Hmm.
So it's like I know, unfortunately, none of the rookie QBs have thrown a touchdown, but I feel like our projections for them the first 2 weeks have been good because they've
Yeah.
been in line with their props and what expectations are. And I think that would have just been significantly harder with our old approach because of that lack of data. Whereas like now we're missing like the concrete data that the old model was built on, but we have so much data from the market which is informed of their college performance, of the system they're
Mhm.
going into, of coaching changes, and all sorts of things that are a lot harder for us to get until they start showing up in data, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. What are some of the again? I know it's only been 2 weeks, but as the season goes along, what are some of the ways that like we quantitatively check this kind of stuff? Like, what are some of the metrics that we're looking through over the course of the season to say, okay, we got better in this way by X amount?
Yeah, so that's like a big thing that I focused on in the off season. One of my projects was building like a accuracy tracker, basically.
Hmm.
And so we do a couple of things, but the most important one to me is the distributions. So for each player's like stat, like all of their stats within the sim, including like fantasy points, but also like passing yards, rushes, rushing yards, etc. We're like storing and keeping track of what our predicted percentiles or was, yeah, for all of these stats,
Hmm.
and then as well as the actual observed for that game. And so this lets us go back and then compare, like, okay, how many time, like, what percent of the time was like the rushing yards under the 25th percentile We
Yeah.
want that to be like right about 25% of the time. And so doing that lets us like check the calibration of all of the stats and everything like that, on
Mhm.
top of just like the standard things like R squared or, that kind of stuff for the means.
Is there any reason to think that like the distributions in particular would have gotten better with this project, or is it more the mean projections, or just kind of everything just gets like a little bit better across the board?
I think that it would like I'm not 100% sure on this take. Like Matt might disagree, but to me, I feel like the distributions probably got better,
Hmm.
just because of like the way that we're like handling the total game distributions, like the alt
Yeah.
totals and everything like that. I feel like that probably has like a rundown effect on making like the tails a bit wider, than we might have been considering before for players. And so I think like that's my gut thinking is that it will improve that. And then definitely with mean predictions, that should definitely improve.
Yeah, I agree. I think the means have probably had this update had a bigger impact on those. But yeah, especially using all of those like, alt team total, alt spread, game total lines, to kind of dial in the sims after they run, uh, is going to have a decent effect on those distributions. And we'll see better. A lot of the data, unfortunately, we didn't have for last year. So, back we did back test quite a bit in terms of like some of the player stuff, but we didn't have all of the data to be able to back test like fully. So it'll be good to see, probably in a week or two, be able to kind of look at what we have and see where there still is room for improvement, and see where we're at with those distributions and calibrations. Just like eye test wise, like correlations, I know last year or in the past we had some, I don't know if it's like issues or just some of like the correlations, especially between like opposing defenses, kicker defense, sometimes looked a little bit weird or just didn't quite match what we would expect, where like you want to have a, positive correlation between like kicker and defense, and negative between opposing defenses or something like that. And a lot of those numbers look much better just on the eye test when we're looking at the correlations this year. And that wasn't something that we were trying to do. Um, Necessarily, but I think it just a lot of the improvements we made overall to the model, it uh, helped improve those naturally.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I mean, anecdotally, the correlations like seem to be also a little bit more specific. Like I think we've always done a pretty good job of like rushing quarterback, maybe a little bit less correlated to his pass catchers than a pure pocket passer. And again, that's something that I think we've done a decent job of before, but it just feels one more degree dialed into me. And I know, I mean, that's like a very qualitative
Yeah.
take. But just
Eh,
looking through, I've been poking around like things we seem to be less general about how we categorize particular players and more specific of like, no, that actually seems like a very fine-tuned. And I think that's probably like some of those prop markets of like, completions,
Right.
receptions, like I longest reception props. Like there's all these different ways that you can take in information from the markets here and have a better sense of what their outcomes actually look like.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that we have always been specific with like stuff like that, but I think, like you said,
Hmm.
we're more accurate at like, Lamar's rush attempts and touchdowns and stuff, and like even just the difference between a quarterback that rushes a lot but doesn't get a lot of touchdowns versus, like Hurts, for example,
For
with
sure.
the
Yeah.
tush push stuff, like, he's going to have a pretty high like touchdown per rushing yard ratio because like and that's going to show up in the props, and it might not have shown up as well, without having that data. I think the other thing I do want to bring up that's sort of like a little bit like more meta or higher level, but like because we don't have to focus as much on like fixing like player level projections and like
Hmm.
rates and all that stuff, because we can rely on the props for that, we can like focus a lot more of our time on the logic of the sim and getting those distributions and correlations right, and not get distracted by like, hey, why is this rookie quarterback projected for 5 points more than he should be? Because
Hmm.
like we know we can kind of rely on that stuff, and we can really focus on what the markets are missing, not where they're wrong, but just where like there aren't really great markets for a lot of for like correlations and I mean, you could maybe use like same game parlay stuff, but like really, I think that's where this play-by-play sim is so valuable. It's not in projecting the each player's like passing yards per per completion or whatever. It's like in actually giving us an accurate range of outcomes, accurate correlations, upside correlations. And so Will and Eric can like just focus on that, get our play-by-play sim as accurate as it can be, and not spend all this time like fixing or just like improving those inputs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I know along with this has come a little bit of a way that like we've changed our sim scheduling on not only Sundays, I guess, but also just over the course of the week as we are getting information how those projections change. I guess starting with Sunday, the big change we made is not running kind of that like final sim 60 minutes before
Mm-hmm.
kickoff and instead just running sims as additional information is coming in. Can you just kind of I guess talk a little bit about that as well in terms of why that was changed and in relation to the listening to Vegas more here?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, if we're using Vegas as input, like those lines are changing
Hmm.
constantly, and like the closer we get to the start of the game, the more accurate they're going to be. That's really just that's sort of like one of the fundamental like truths. I mean, maybe it's not true in 100% of cases, but for the
Hmm.
most part, the closer we are to game time, that more accurate those lines are going to be. Maybe with the exception of like Super Bowl or something where like a lot of the soft money comes in at the end or something. But yeah, so basically as that data changes, we want to make sure that our projections are accounting for those changes. And it just not updating at all in the last hour is going to be missing some of that data. Obviously, we do have to kind of balance that with like having a not confusing experience for users where they don't know when they should build
Right.
and stuff. And that's something that's going to be partly just sort of talking about it more, educating people on like build early and like kind of look at what's changing, but you don't have to change like rerun things after every sim.
Hmm.
It kind of just depends, and that is it's a tricky balance. But, as a DFS player, it's hard to like know to like build and then see a new sim come in and have to decide what you're going to do. So I definitely get that, but just sort of like we want to put it in users' hands and let them make the decision rather than us making the decision of like, oh, we're just not going to run a sim because nothing changed. So that's something that's sort of like an active process. The
Yeah.
first couple of weeks, I think we didn't do too much. We ran some, I mean, especially with like Evan Ingram, I think obviously that news was pretty late. We reran, but I think as the season progresses, this week and moving forward, we will be running more sims late, depending on what changes. I think a good example, which we didn't account for on Monday because it was so late, but I think it was Covey, right? The wide receiver, like it was announced that he was like starting like 10 minutes before lock or something. At that point, we didn't have time to run a sim anyway. But
Hmm.
like if that had gotten announced, say 30 minutes before, and the props had updated where like his receptions, his receiving yards, anytime TD, whatever,
Hmm.
changed, like we likely would have run a new sim because that's important information that it changes his projection and changes kind of like the whole game, and we want to account for that. So that's the kind of thing that we will be looking at. I think it's going to be, a we're going to adjust that process as a team ourselves of like figuring out when to run sims in that last hour, but like where the thresholds are of data changing. We obviously don't want to just run sims for like 1 yard changes, but there's
Right.
going to be some thresholds where the lines change. If there's a bunch of sharp money that comes in, in that last hour, that's shifting a, passing yards prop from 275 to 260 or something like that. That's a decent change. Or if there's like they post prop slate where someone might not have a like rushing yards prop and then it gets posted late and we want to make sure that we're accounting for that new data. So and I do one last thing is that we're going to be more transparent about that actual data too, where
Mhm.
you'll be able to, this isn't there yet, but in the app, be able to click on a game and like see actually like, okay, these are the props that were used, these are the lines that were used. And so, again, really trying to focus on the transparency and giving SaberSim users the information and letting them make the decision. So if you can click in and see like, okay, there isn't like this sim didn't have a rushing yards prop for this player. And in those cases, we're kind of using like player prior, like we're using historical data
Mhm.
and estimating and doing our best. But that if if as a user you can see where there's data missing, it makes it a lot easier to kind of make an informed
Yeah.
change, and people like, okay, I have an opinion about what this player is going to do here. There's no prop for them. That's probably a higher value change than changing a player where we do have all the props. And so you can kind of see where there might be more uncertainty in the projections by looking at that. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, so
Will, did you have something that you were gonna add to that? You look like you were about to say something.
No, I feel like Matt covered it all.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, so I guess on a similar note here, I think the kind of rollout of projections over the course of the week is a little bit different as well. Obviously the slate locks on Sunday, and that's when our focus is being the most accurate, when people are on Sunday mornings building their lineups. But for people that maybe are building throughout the week or kind of getting a sense of the slate, starting to research, what does kind of like our, I guess, schedule look like as we're starting to run some of the early sims over the course of the week?
Yeah, so it definitely gets a bit tricky dealing with the early week stuff,
Yeah.
when there's like not props posted or not a lot of props posted.
Hmm.
And that's definitely like something that we're still like working on and tweaking and figuring out. Because it's just, right now we're switching to a method that's more like what Matt said, like based on the players prior. So like based on, okay, like they average 30 pass attempts, and like, if the only prop that we have posted is like they're passing touchdowns and that's a bit higher than average, like bump up their passing sets to accommodate.
Yeah.
So we're working on like figuring out that so that the early week sims look better, but it's definitely like we get significantly more accurate as the props come up, and so like as that more data comes in, that like significantly improves our projection accuracy. So like the later in the week, like Thursday is when like a lot of like, at least I've noticed on DraftKings, like when a lot of the detailed player props, like beyond just like, because early in the week, like they'll put up like Lamar's rushing yards or something like that. But
Yeah.
as the week goes on, they'll give you Lamar's rushing attempts, and like they'll get a lot more detailed in terms of like the number of players and what markets are offered, and that helps us considerably.
mhm.
Nice. Matt, you had mentioned a change in the future here of basically exposing in the app, like, hey, we don't have props for this particular player. We're missing this prop for this particular player. I do think that'll be really useful for people that do like to tinker a little bit, research a little bit, target that research there. In the meantime, are there types or categories of players or games or anything like that that we kind of think maybe it is a little bit more useful to dig into for folks that do want to spend a little bit of extra time researching? I don't know if it's something like maybe
Mhm.
by like salary or by even position, or maybe like game script, like a spread, or do we just kind of, is there any like, I don't know, like a breadcrumb of like, this might be something that you should actually kind of go look into?
Yeah, my first thought is with like the scrubs.
Yeah.
Essentially like the players that either don't have props or have very illiquid props, because like who's betting on them?
Yeah.
Those kinds of plays are like they're obviously going to be our weakest because they're the least informed markets. So like I feel like that's the most valuable. That's where my mind first goes with that kind of question.
Yeah, definitely agree. I mean, Showdown is going to be the big one where I think there's going to be more edge from that kind of thing. Where if it like, on a main slate, changing someone from 2 points to 3 points doesn't change anything. You're not going to get them regardless. But Showdown,
Hmm.
that could be a pretty huge. Again with the example of Covey, like that he broke the slate. He was in the winning lineup. He was 3% owned.
Hmm.
If you like did research or like saw that news and pumped him up, that's kind of where you can really add value, is if you have those, yeah, those takes on those players that don't have as much information. Yeah, I mean, beyond that, it's like I think the sources of edge beyond just like content, the built-in stuff in SaberSim, added value for users is like, one, if you think that there are props that are wrong,
Yeah.
um, you know, again, like if you're gonna bet a prop, then you might as well. And if for people that do bet props, like you should change their projection too. If
Hmm.
you are think that the prop is wrong, and assuming it doesn't like change, if assuming it's not like betting on Thursday and then um, it changes by the time it's Sunday. But if it's close um, to kickoff and you think the prop is wrong, then bet it, and then also change the projection, because you're kind of saying this is my assumption about the player that I think is different than what Vegas thinks. And then yeah, I mean, on the correlation, like that kind of thing, I think there's probably something there, in terms of like maybe you agree with like the mean prop projections, but you think that like in maybe you did research and you see that like a team, when they're up by two or more scores, they don't give any usage to X player, right?
Yeah.
Like this player is much more likely to just sit in a blowout, but this other player is much more likely to just keep playing. That I think that's especially for something like NBA, like a really
Yeah.
valuable. But I think probably even NFL, I haven't really done that type of research, but I would imagine that there's sort of the like range of outcome type um, edges where you can see like obviously you're going for a 99th percentile or more outcome with your lineup, and so even if you think like this guy's mean projection is correct, I mean, um like you can see like, okay, in the games where the team is blowing out, this team is going to like rest all their starters, and this team is just going to keep like passing the ball no matter what. So that's kind of the other uh area that I would focus probably.
You had mentioned NBA. Is this something that we are interested in kind of taking this direction and applying it to other sports? I think NFL
Yeah.
is obviously a little bit unique in just how massive the markets are, but what are our thoughts for like rolling this out to other sports?
Yeah, so definitely I think we want to, in every sport, we want to try to use like sports book data, as much as we can, because again, there's like this value in the wisdom of the crowds.
Yeah.
NBA is especially tricky because they don't post props for nearly as many. I mean, NFL, there's props for every single player.
Hmm.
Um,
There's
at least like
defensive
an anytime
backs with
TD.
touchdown, right?
Right, exactly. NBA, like they're often not going to post anything for like bench players, other than kind of like the like expected bench players that are getting like 20 plus minutes. And then there's the late news where if there's a change in the starting lineup, they'll probably just pull the whole game and
Hmm.
probably won't repost it, or often won't repost it. And so we do have to have a much better like internal model. I think we are still going to make a lot of improvements there, where we're, I think, really going to focus on like those priors and making sure our baseline rates for all the players are accurate. I think like
Hmm.
rookies especially, and like low players with low amounts of data, we have historically struggled a bit more with. So that's probably going to be the focus, so that in those
Yeah.
situations where we don't have props, we have a really good baseline. But yeah, I mean, in every sport, I mean, MLB, we haven't quite gone the extent of NFL, but we are incorporating a lot of the sports book odds and props into the output, at least to kind of like dial in the projections, not as much as like fully 100% going that direction, but if anybody's been paying attention to that stuff, I think you probably would have noticed that we're much closer to, we don't have as many of these like huge edges versus the prop lines as we used to. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think every sport, that's the direction that we want to go, uh, you know, moving forward.
Am I? It feels also like our field lineups probably should have gotten at least like incrementally better here with this,
Mhm.
or does that make sense, or
Yeah.
is that
Yeah, I
am
mean,
I
we're
like
gonna be
galaxy brain
closer
that a little?
to,
Yeah.
I would say, like, in general, probably the field, the aggregate projections that the field is using are gonna be pretty close to props because, again, it's like the
Hmm.
wisdom of the crowd. Like, there's gonna be it's not gonna be a one-to-one, and obviously, like, probably, more fishy, bad lineups are going to, like, not care about the props and be like, "Hey, I see a player that I know or I like or
You
I
mean
follow, and I'm gonna
Dolphins
play him."
fanatic with his 7-man Dolphins stack?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think the fact that our projections are closer to the like overall field and the industry are probably going to make the field lineups more accurate just because like we're building
Right.
the field not just off of our projections. We do like adjust for other factors, but like that isn't um the projections that we have are going to strongly impact the field that we're projecting. So yeah, I think it will be more accurate.
What are some of the things that are still on the docket here for us? I know as soon as football starts, like we're kind of pushing out as much as we can, and then NBA, you already mentioned it, comes in really hot, and we kind of have to transition pretty quickly. Just some of the things that maybe we're still hoping to accomplish for this NFL season, or maybe even some like bigger kind of dream projects that we've seen as a result of doing this that we're like, oh, maybe even 2025 season, that would be really cool.
Yeah, so for me, it's early week sims. That's my like number one
Yeah.
focus at the moment. Is just like right now, like I don't feel great about like what we post on Tuesday, Wednesday.
Hmm.
And that's something that like, we're working on a lot of projects and I feel like we'll probably get them dialed in the next couple of days. But that's my main thing that I'm still working on for football is making sure that like they're not going to be as good because again, like we're leaning heavily into those props and without them we're missing that data. But getting those to look a lot better is totally feasible, and that's what I'm hoping to knock out here soon.
Yeah, and not just early week, but also when there's late news and like props get pulled for a game or something like that, we want to make sure that we're still able to update our projections with like reasonable results. And or players that don't have props, we want to make sure that we're kind of inferring the rest of their stats and using that historical data. I mean, obviously, historical data is also a really important data to use, and
Right.
you know, we want to make sure that we're using that in conjunction or to fill in those holes that props are missing. Um, the other thing I think is just adding like more markets too. So like like I said, we're using the props, we're using all these all um, team totals and game bets, but I think there's so much that you can bet on and so many different markets that are provided and probably continuously adding more. So I think again some of those like um the like alt like prop stuff where it's not just like the mean or median, but QB passing for 3 touchdowns and stuff like that. Obviously, those are the one-sided markets are more difficult to incorporate because it's
Hmm.
hard to kind of remove the vig from that. The two-sided ones are the ones I prefer to focus on.
Yeah.
But there's still like so much additional stuff out there that we can and even like first half stuff or like quarter, stuff about like we can kind of improve even the game script stuff with like those, first half quarter level, and at that point, they are um, less liquid. And so we need to be more cautious about like, we don't want to go too far that we're like sacrificing some sim integrity just to hit these props. But
Yeah.
the way that we incorporate them is sort of like we're starting with the sim and then kind of adjusting. So, even if we have these like, say, first half markets that are maybe adjusting what the sim would do. Like we're running the sims and kind of adjusting after the fact in a lot of these cases. So we kind of maintain that sim integrity.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting. And I might reveal some of my lack of understanding of like betting markets here by asking this, but how do we kind of reconcile one, I guess, the different quality in different books, especially when they're in conflict, but also like arbitrages between, like, even within a book where maybe like a certain line has gotten stale that isn't in line with the way that this even the sports book thinks that the game is going to go. Like maybe, you know,
Hmm.
like one prop is now out of date with the way that like the
Yeah.
book clearly thinks that the game is intended to go because of some news that changed. Like how do we handle those kinds of edge cases there?
So I think with regards to the first one, I think there's like one or two books that we like ignored for just like being bad and not
Yeah.
updating and that kind of stuff. But in general, the books are pretty much in agreement, especially for like the major props like main players.
Okay.
They're not significantly different from one another.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, like, you know, some have like different VIG and stuff like that, and you have to account for that. And then with the other one, we do to some extent like sort of, you know, we make sure that like the receptions, like the sum of the receptions props equal to the completions prop of the quarterback, like that kind of things, like making sure that those are in line. So it's not like, you know, there's 23 receptions and 20
Hmm.
completions. So making sure that those line up, the yards line up, the touchdowns line up. Doing that, I think, handles a fair bit of your secondary concern there.
Hmm.
Just like making sure that it all like flows into one concrete game script. I think that there may be like a smarter way to do that. Like if you are able to determine like, oh, it's because like this line is stale. We're not doing that yet. Right now we're sort of taking them at like what they've posted. And then just like taking that and combining it and synthesizing it into like, okay, now here's what the aggregate targets are.
Yeah, and like I said before, we prioritize the like main, money line game total spread more than anything else. And those are going to be the ones that are trustworthy and are going to be um not stale. And so we're going to first try to make sure that we're meeting those and then kind of like cascade down.
Hmm.
And then yeah, everything Will said, is right as well. And we are, we're aggregating. So if there's different lines and odds on the different books, like we're kind of aggregating the ones that ignoring certain ones that we don't trust, but like, if there's differences there, we'll aggregate. I think there's probably room for improvement of like weighting certain books higher just based on like accuracy and stuff. I don't think the value of doing that for NFL is super high at this point. I mean, it probably is higher earlier. If you're betting early, there's going to be a lot more differences as we're getting close to the game starting. I doubt there's going to be a ton of significant differences between them, but um, I think that's something that we'll look at and maybe an area of improvement of doing a smarter model of weighting different books and weighting different bets based on their liquidity and all of that.
One other question I had, and I actually meant to ask this as we were getting started here, is just about some of the kind of the initial conversations that took place over this summer as we started to work on this. What were those like? Were there particular like issues that we saw when we were looking into last year that we were like frequently getting wrong on? I'm just kind of curious more about like the problems that we saw and and how this kind of we came up with this as our the solution there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, we have like it's definitely not a new idea, right?
Yeah.
Using props as input. I remember like 3 or 4 years ago, kind of trying to do that for NFL. I don't honestly remember why it didn't work out. I think it was maybe just the data that we were getting was like not being updated quickly enough, or just we didn't have as smart of like a framework for applying those. But I think we had talked about it, and I definitely think there were some concerns in the past about like, oh, they're not like super efficient markets. Like we're not
Hmm.
the props are beatable, and so if they're beatable, then we should like try to beat them rather than match them. And you know, I feel like I was pushing back on that line of thinking a bit in terms of like, even if they're beatable, it's like it's a lot of work and there's a lot of risk to trying to beat props, and especially like they're primarily beatable earlier, and
Right.
closing lines are just, as the betting market has grown and grown, it's just like it's harder and harder to beat closing lines for really any bets. It's certainly possible, but um it's not really worth it.
Hmm.
Again, like we have a small team, we're a small company, and I want like Will to be spending his time like getting the sim, which is like that's our big value add, right? It's like
Hmm.
this play-by-play sim that no one I think is even close to being able to like replicate like the sophisticatedness
Yeah.
of that framework. So focusing really on that and getting that dialed in feels like much better use of time. Um, but yeah, and just sort of like the common issues that we have throughout all of our sports of like the rookies, the players without a lot of data,
Hmm.
where like that's where those props are so valuable. We don't have to worry about oh, there's news that comes out that some X player is going to get limited. Before, like there's no amount of data that we could have. No matter how good our model is, we're not going to account for a coach saying in a press conference
Yeah.
this player is going to get limited, but the prop does tell us that because like immediately, like through people betting it or just through the sports books being good at this, they're gonna like
Hmm.
take the prop down and then put it back up with a lower number, and then we just do that, and we don't have to like make a manual change and be following all that news constantly. And we still have the ability to override, and that is something like we still do um, checks of all of our projections every week, and we're still like looking at that and like paying really close attention to any overrides that we might need to make either through props being wrong or not there, or just like the sim output doesn't match what the input should be for whatever reason. So we are kind
Hmm.
of paying attention to that stuff. But yeah, that's the biggest thing for me is just like any sort of information that is important to a game that's gonna, for the most part, be accounted for and makes it a lot easier for us. So
Yeah, I think part of the reason that I was so excited about this is when you have the play-by-play game sims powering the lineups and then also the contest sim, like you're so far ahead, you don't also need to handicap the market perfectly to be successful. And
mhm.
it's almost bad. Like you're almost taking on more risk than you need to there. And even if
Yep.
you can, or like you're extremely skilled in doing that, the other side of this is, and frankly, I'm not like that's not a strength of mine, but for the user that is, now it's even easier for them to do that. Like I think kind of before we were kind of making that claim of like, yes, we have the play, but we have a play-by-play simulation of the games. We have a contest sim that's helping you identify, but we're also kind of handicapping the market
Hmm.
in a bunch of micro ways that even if they were really right, they were really hard to see what they were, and they led to you taking on a lot more risk. Now,
Yep.
you don't have that as much. Like it's almost like this is definitely not the right word, but it almost feels like a little more pure in a way of like this is like assuming this like set of information is kind of agreed upon about the games. These are the most profitable lineups to play, and then if you disagree with the baseline assumptions, it's easier to see what they were and also how to make your adjustments from there.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, like the giving people like the baseline and then letting
Yeah.
people make their changes from knowing what the baseline is. I think that's kind of like what got me like fully on board with this project and giving up my baby a little bit is like it
Hmm.
really is just like I I I really like the approach and it also makes it a lot less stressful for me. Like, I don't have to be like, okay, my decay rates and all of the things says that uh this guy's actually gonna crush today and everyone says that he sucks. And so like then all Sunday I'm like sitting there like biting my nails to see if like he's actually good or not.
And
Starting
now
from
you
the
can just
baseline.
change his projection. You can do this on your own,
Right.
have
And I
your own
don't have to
model, and
sweat
like Will
everyone.
can. Right, exactly. Yeah.
I'm curious. Like we talked NBA a little bit, baseball a little bit, but I mean, is there a home for some of this in some of the more niche sports, like a
Well, it's already in UFC.
MMA? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
A
so I
little
mean
bit, yeah, but we talked about this just this
yeah,
past
there's
week of like incorporating it a little bit more.
Yeah.
right, when it comes to, like, decisions, because that's, like, the biggest thing that I get questioned on, that not to, like, switch this to a UFC talk, but, like, our decisions are decided in the sim based on the outcome of the stats, and incorporating this approach a bit more will allow us to match Vegas for decisions as well, while still maintaining, like, okay, they actually won that sim.
Hmm.
So, like, that'll be really good, but yeah, like, it is already, like, the concept of, like in UFC we use those like finish props as guidelines. So like, like
Yeah.
this fighter wins in the first round 11% of sims, and if you looked at 11% of the sims, you would see a first round knockout for him. And so like
Mhm.
that's that concept is already applied elsewhere, but now it's in the main sports.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I know we have to get out of here pretty quick. Maybe as a last question here, we've covered a lot of this kind of stuff throughout, but is there any other practical takeaways that you would leave our users with sitting down to build on Sunday? Anything else that this might change their process? One thing that jumps out to me, and maybe this is a bit of a cop out because I've recommended against doing this forever anyway. If you are still aggregating projections, it seems even more of a waste of time to me now at this point. Essentially, like knowing how we are kind of doing that for you in some ways. Um, that's not something I've recommended almost ever, so it does feel a little bit of a cop out. But that jumped out to me. Anything for you guys of just like practical advice for people heading into this Sunday?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think I've talked about it. I mean, this is like not exactly related to the model update, but it's sort of related to like the sim schedule stuff. And I mentioned it when I like announced it in Discord, but like I would really recommend to people to like build like
That's a good
early
one. Yeah.
on Sunday.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, obviously, like in one way that kind of contradicts what I was saying about like the closer we get to the start time, the more accurate stuff is. Um, but I think because of the fact that we're not doing these like final sims, like I think just for NFL especially, like we have the vast majority of the news for the slate early, and obviously things can change. But it's really important, especially if you have a like longer process or if you want to do more research, like do your builds, get everything kind of set up
Hmm.
early and get lineups in that like you would be happy playing. And then there's kind of less stress about adapting to those later sims. You can look at what's changing, you can rerun everything, but if you have everything already set up in all of your rules, all of your like contest sims, all of your metrics, whatever, then it's just sort of like rerunning and the build and rerunning the sim or just rerunning the sim.
Hmm.
And uh, I think just from a process standpoint, I think it's just really important to kind of like have everything in and ready earlier, and then you're just having to like make smaller changes to adjust for new sims that come in rather than like, okay, I'm going to start my process 50 minutes before lock every week.
Yeah. No, it's a good one, and I think that's probably something that hopefully, barring another Evan Ingram this week, we'll have another opportunity to kind of practice on. But what I was prepared to do this week was exactly as you described. I think I had my initial builds done like an hour and 15 minutes before lock, and I was just going to contest sim it again if there was
Hmm.
subsequent sims with no significant projection changes. Obviously, we ended up
Hmm.
getting the Evan Ingram news, but also very cool, and a cool case study for that is, if I remember correctly, we just ran one additional sim after that news broke, and we kind of had updated to that one. Like in the past, I think a lot of our users are probably used to the idea of like there's kind of that initial sim that runs, and then sometimes we look at the results of that and then we have to tweak a little bit more, and then maybe potentially tweak a little bit
Yeah.
more. Not to say that will never happen, but knowing where some of our information is coming from now, I would assume those kind of initial changes for news will be a little sharper.
Yeah, and just to clarify, like the process there is like we have it set up right now so that if books basically pull props, which usually happens if there's an injury like that, they'll like
Yeah.
initially they'll just pull everything down, and then it'll be like 5-10 minutes later where they'll kind of start posting everything again. And so in those cases, we're just gonna wait. So basically, like if there were props for a game and then they get pulled, we're not gonna run new sims like guessing and then run another sim once they're pulled. We'll just sort of wait for things to settle. I mean, assuming we're not like right before a lock. This don't take what I'm saying for like NBA.
Yeah.
But like for NFL, assuming it's not like, okay, there's 10 minutes before lock and someone got ruled out, like, I mean, in that case, maybe we'll just like mark them out and let everybody. It just depends on the timing of everything. But yeah, in general, um, we're gonna wait for the props to get posted again. And the team is actively monitoring too. It's like we're always
Mhm.
going to be like looking at the stuff when the Engram stuff news came out. We're like, okay, let's like see what the data is, like make overrides if we need to. I think maybe we initially did an override for Strange's backup, and I think actually in that case when they posted props for Strange, it ended up being like exactly what we had already done as the override, so we didn't even need to like do another sim on top of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes, especially in those cases, the initial props that the books put up for those like new players might not be very sharp. And so that's probably a situation where we might run a couple sims because it's like, okay, they're posting this new player, this new prop at like 20.5 yards, and then he ends up getting steamed up to 30, and we'll want to account for that
Mhm.
difference. So, again, like you're right that like hopefully we don't have to run a ton, but in those
Yeah.
cases where it's like new, like big news, like we might try to dial in. But from a process perspective, I definitely would recommend like, quick swap the out player out, get an initial build in with like the updated news, and then kind of just monitor and rerun if you can. And just you always want to be in a spot where like you're comfortable with the lineups that you have uploaded to the sites,
Mhm.
and never feel like, okay, if lock just suddenly happened, or if I lost internet right now, I would be completely screwed. You always want to be in a situation where you're like, okay, I wouldn't be like completely screwed. I would be
That
at
is
least
a
like
really good
in
way
a
to put
decent
it.
spot.
Yeah, I don't. That is a great line. I'm gonna steal that. I don't know why I've never just said it like that before in any other video,
Yeah,
but yeah, just at any point you're not screwed if your internet went out is a very good way to think about
yeah.
your lead up to lock. So I like it. Will, did you have a practical takeaway you wanted to give everyone, or are you still push button print money gang?
I am literally that was the exact thing I was about to say. All I do is just trust the Sims. I'm a bit
Nice.
biased because I worked on them. So,
You
but
sound
yeah,
like
no,
Scott.
yeah, my process is the most boring process in the world. I make a few tweaks and like X out players that I don't want to play,
Yeah.
and then I build, run a contest sim, and upload.
Which
That's it.
which players do you not want to play this week?
Uh, Cleveland's offense.
All right. Cool. Well,
There,
we'll
there's
leave
my
everyone.
yeah. Well, there's the tout show for the day.
There's yeah, exactly. I said we'll leave everyone with a take. Fade Cleveland. Cool. Sounds good. Well, I know we need to run, so we'll go ahead and cap things off there. For anybody that has stuck it out with us here, we do have a free 5-day trial on our site at sabersim.com if you want to come check us out for a free 5 days. For any of our existing members, as always, conversation continues in Discord. If there are questions, comments, any thoughts you have that you wanted to share for the three of us, you can pop those into the Discord server. But Matt, Will, thanks for hopping on and chatting with me, and we'll see everybody later.
Too.
Thanks.